I want you to turn to Matthew chapter 13. Thank you for being a part of this study on Saturday night. Matthew chapter 13. We're looking at the parable of the mustard seed, which is verse 31 and 32. Matthew chapter 13, verse 31 and 32. Jesus is telling parables and says another parable. It says another parable he put forth to them, saying, "The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed, which a man took and sowed in his field, which indeed is the least of all the seeds. But when it is grown, it is greater than the herbs and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and nest in its branches." This is a good example of saturation. We have not just reached into this chapter and pulled out this parable and said, hey, we want to study the parable of the mustard seed. You could get a lot of truth out of it, there's no doubt about that, just in the parable itself. But finding it, and it's in the flow and why he spoke it and where in the context of what he's saying becomes very, very important. And last Saturday night I walked you through chapter 12 again, which of course is the context of this. And we discovered in chapter 12 an overwhelming controversy. It all happened on the Sabbath day. It is a controversy between Jesus and his viewpoint and the Pharisees and their viewpoint. And they started out with the disciples picking grain on the Sabbath day. And of course the Pharisees were all bent out of shape about that. And Jesus said God doesn't care. And you got two different viewpoints coming at you. They move into the synagogue and Jesus heals a man with a withered hand. And of course the Pharisees set him up on that because they knew he would do that. He couldn't help himself. Why? Because that's the way God is. And yet they're all bent out of shape. So you got two viewpoints again. They go into a conference room and plot murder, how they're going to kill Jesus. Not if they're going to kill him, but how they're going to kill him. And Jesus goes out and heals all the multitude. Two different viewpoints, two different activities, two different ways of attitude, two different flows. They come out, see the whole multitude and see everything that's going on and the excitement of the crowd and try to explain it all away by saying, hey, he's in league with Beelzebub the devil. He's in league with Beelzebub, the prince of demons, and he's doing all this by the power of the devil. Again, two viewpoints, two different ways of looking at it, two perspectives. Jesus, in each of those cases, has given them amazing theology, amazing insight, even down to giving them physical examples of the whole thing, and has tried to lay it all out for them. And they don't buy any of it. They're sticking to what they see, what their viewpoint is, how they feel. Finally, it's the end of the day. Jesus begins to preach and begins to tell these stories. The disciples are so moved by all of this, they come up and say, why are you telling these stories? Why has your whole approach to preaching changed? And he said, hey, don't you know the day we've just gone through? And all of these stories are confronting these Pharisees that he has come up against all day long and the controversy that he has faced. The mustard seed is right in the middle of that. And he's speaking to them, hoping that in story form a truth will get into them that will resonate deep in their soul, rest deep in their inner being, and someday when they're riding in their chariot down the road, it'll just pop into their head and they'll see the truth because they won't be able to get away from that story. So he's telling parables. The whole chapter is full of them, these stories. Now, in this story, he's saying, giving them a concept. And we've been working on that concept. I love concepts. See, the concept of this story is the fact that this is not about proper actions. See, there's nothing in the parable about proper actions. The Pharisees are all into what? Proper actions. Here's the way you act on the Sabbath day. Here's what you do and what you don't do. Here's where you can go and where you can't go. Here's how you can act and how you cannot act, all on the Sabbath day. They had all the proper actions. Jesus never mentions that at all. And note, he's describing the kingdom of heaven. And he never mentions proper actions. Well, aren't proper actions necessary? Yes, act properly. No question. But that's not the concept of the kingdom. The concept of the kingdom is way beyond what you do. It's way beyond the physical action of your being. It's way beyond the rules. And oh, this is such old truth, isn't it? It's not about proper action. It's about the very heart of God himself. In fact, when you look at the parable, do you understand it isn't anything about what the mustard seed did? Do you get this? Look at this again. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed. So evidently, the kingdom of heaven is not about the man who sowed the seed. The kingdom of heaven is all about the mustard seed. Would you agree? Nod your heads. Oh, you are awake. So it's not about the man who sowed in the field. It's about the mustard seed and what's happening within the mustard seed itself. And the only action in the whole parable is the man who took and sowed in his field the mustard seed. So there's nothing about the mustard seed in terms of action. It's all about the heart of God working in growth within the mustard seed itself, which is phenomenal. So the issue of the parable, the concept of the parable is, would you allow, see how this fits into chapter 12, would you allow God to take you and do to you what he wants to do? You old mustard seed, you. Would you allow that? Pharisees said absolutely not. We've got it all figured out. They're not open. They're shutting it down. Jesus is saying, hey, here's where I want you. He's telling parables. It's all about a mustard seed being open to God. It's the issue of the parable. Now, in the progression of this, as we've dealt week after week after week with this parable, we talked to you about the movement. And there's no doubt at all that as he lays this out in terms of what the kingdom of God is, in terms of a mustard seed growing into a full-blown tree so that the birds of the air come and nest in it, that the idea of the kingdom is in the movement, the moving force of the presence of God working within a mustard seed, doing something tremendous in terms of destiny and bringing that mustard seed into the fullness of all that he dreamed it could be. That is a movement. There is no old covenant and new covenant. The old covenant is now gone. We're not interested in that. Probably wasn't any good in the first place. We're just into the new covenant. That's not his approach. His approach is that the old covenant was the mustard seed, but now it's grown into a full-blown new covenant, and the two are connected. This is not God coming and wiping out an old covenant saying, hey, that's no good anymore. This is about God taking what he gave then and bringing it into fruition. He gave this for a purpose. So this is not about bad-mouthing the Old Testament in light of the greatness of the New Testament. This is about seeing the Old Testament in light of the New Testament and the fullness of what he's really bringing about in the movement. Would you let him do that in your life? Take you from where you are and bring you into full fruition of what he desires, the movement. Last week, or maybe it was the week before, we started talking about the element of ministry in this concept. There is no question at all that in the parable, a part of the concept is that there is a ministry that you are destined for. Man, how I want you to get this. You realize that the whole climax of the parable is a mustard seed that's grown into a full-blown tree and now has a destiny and a ministry. A ministry of safe harbor, a ministry of birds nesting in its branches, a ministry of safety, and all of that is being pulled into this mustard seed that's become a tree. That ministry is not about what anyone is doing, it's about everything the mustard seed has become. So we started out last week by talking to you about comparison. Interesting that the comparison of ministry in the parable is the comparison of least and greater. And I suggested to you, the minute you begin to talk about least and greater in terms of ministry, we immediately begin to think in terms of action of ministry. My ministry is greater than your ministry. Why? Because I do more in ministry than you do. Obviously, full-time people in ministry are more valuable to God than laymen who have to work for a living. And that's why we became preachers, so we wouldn't have to. So we're greater and least. See, we give a comparison in amount of activity. See, his ministry is greater. Why? His church is bigger. His ministry is least. His church is smaller. And we set up that comparison. There's nothing like that in the parable. Nothing like that. Again, because there is no doing involved. The whole issue of ministry is, will you allow God to take you from where you are, grow you into the fullness of what He dreamed you could be, and will you become a place of safety? In other words, the ministry is found in the growth and the progression of what God is doing in your life. We suggested this to you out of Matthew chapter 28, which is the Great Commission. And we suggested to you that when Jesus said, "Go, therefore, and make disciples," He was not talking about making disciples at all. And I suggested to you that the idea of making disciples comes from a word that we have no way of translating because we don't have anything like it. And it's two ideas put together, and the two ideas are believing and service or following. And when those two ideas come together, you have what we term a disciple. Well, what if I believe, but I'm not following? Then you're not a disciple. What if I follow, but I'm not believing? Then you're not a disciple. Well, I'm half a disciple. You can't be a half a disciple. You either are or you aren't, and it's found in that combination of believing and following, which attaches itself to Jesus in the flow of what He wants to do in your life, and you literally become a disciple. And in the process of becoming a disciple, you find other disciples showing up. In other words, you don't make disciples. Got a seminar on it. If you'd come every Saturday, when you get done with the seminar, I'd give you a button. I'm a disciple. Whoa! That's not what He's talking about. He's talking about you going all out for Jesus and believing with your whole heart, being thrilled with Him, and letting Him grow you into a tree. And in the growth of you becoming a tree, you minister. Has nothing to do with what you're doing. Has everything to do with who you are. Now, obviously, if you are, you're going to do. I get that. We're not downplaying the doing. We're not saying you're going to be lazy, please. We're saying there is this phenomenal opportunity of you literally, this is a thought. Wouldn't it be something if this is not about, when I'm 80, I'll become a tree? Wouldn't it be something if this is when I'm 190 million years old, I will become a tree? What if this is an eternal deal? What if the mustard seed growing into the full tree is not about 70, 80, 90 years? What if it's about forever? What if He's always going to be doing this in my life? And what if I'm always going to be ministering? What if you don't retire in heaven? Woo! No harp. Oh, thank you, Jesus. Didn't want to play one anyway. Wow. And no eternal shuffleboard. Wow. We're going to lay foundations all eternity. Woo! Wouldn't that be something? Wouldn't that be something? That what we're talking about is a continual unfolding seed becoming a tree. And that process, that working of God in your life is the very dynamics by which ministry takes place. Wow, I love that. Just had to give you that again. Tonight I want to talk to you about connection. We're talking about ministry now. We're talking about mustard seed, the concept, movement, ministry. Under ministry, you got comparison and connection. In the parable, this is so awesome, there is a connection, already mentioned it, between least and greater. It's not that I stumble along in life and discover, oh my, there's a penny. It's least compared to a cloud in the sky. Well, that's true. Doesn't have even close to the size of a cloud in the sky. I got that. So this is least. Cloud in the sky is greater. By the way, I'm keeping the penny. So, that's not the least and the greater he's talking about here. The least and greater, see, there's no connection between a penny and a cloud. The least and greater he's talking about here is connected. In other words, the least begins to become. It's the seed of, it's the flow from which, it's the basis of the greater, which is the tree. So the least is the seed, the greater is the tree, and they're distinctly connected. And there is no greater without the least. And if you don't buy into the least, you don't get the greater. And if you never become least in your own thought process, you never become the greater, the tree. They are distinctly, absolutely connected. Now notice, the least is all contained in the seed, which belongs to a man who took and sowed in his field. Which that in itself is a phenomenal idea. And we've been harping on that for months. See, leastness is found in helplessness. Leastness is found in attitude. Leastness is found in seeing yourself as you are. Leastness is found in viewing your life as, wow, I'm not adequate to handle this. Never have been. Leastness is looking at your future, your present, and your future and saying, there is no way I can work all of this out. I am least. And it's embracing that leastness in openness to a man, in this case it would be Jesus, coming and taking you and planting you. And if that planting never takes place, there's no tree. Now it's interesting in the scriptures that this planting idea is termed in terms of dying, which is interesting language. For instance, Jesus was headed towards the cross, and in the process of coming into Jerusalem, there was these guys, these Greeks from Athens. They came, and it doesn't exactly say so, but the scholars assumed that they came to Andrew and said, we want to see Jesus. And Jesus went, and Andrew went and told his brother, and they went and got Jesus. And it's surmised that what they wanted to do was to take Jesus back to Athens and build a school. That would be phenomenal. Jesus could be the head of a school. He could write fat books. Everybody would love him. And he would be another Socrates, another Plato. Jesus. Wow. And Jesus answered them in that setting and said, hey, not a bit interested at all. Not a bit. The reason is because the hour has come that the Son of Man must be glorified. Oh, you didn't get that, did you? He said. I'll explain it to you. He said, if you take a grain of wheat and put it on the palm of your hand and stand on your front porch, and it's May, the month of May, and you're standing there staring at one grain of wheat. You stand there for at least a month, 30 days, and stare at a grain of wheat. Your wife brings you a sandwich. You're staring at 1 grain of wheat. At the end of the month, it's still sitting there. You've got 1 grain of wheat on your hand. If you spend all of June staring at 1 grain of wheat, all of July staring at in fact, August, 1 grain of wheat. In fact, September, 1 grain of wheat. In fact, October, 1 grain of wheat. In fact, winter is now upon you. Snow is blowing, and you're staring at 1 grain of wheat. You reach down, pick it up. Well, 1 grain of wheat. He says, if you don't take that 1 grain of wheat, and if it doesn't die, that's his language. If it doesn't die. If it dies, it produces many grains. The production, the tree thing, see, he follows through on this. The tree thing is all wrapped up in the dying thing. And contained within the least is a man taking the seed, this case Jesus, and planting that seed. And if you're the seed, what does he want you to do? He's going to plant you, and you are going to absolutely lose your life. That's always been his language. Everywhere you go in the gospel, you will find that. That language of dying. And in losing your life, you save your life. If you seek to save your life, you will lose it. That's his language. Do your best to protect yourself. And guess what? The winter comes anyway. And there is no protection. Lose your life, and guess what? Production is everywhere. Well, how do I produce? You don't. You just let him. And it's in the dying. That's his whole premise. In fact, you'll remember the crucifixion. These guys are all standing around the crucifixion of Jesus, and it's amazing to me how God gets the strangest. He doesn't just tell truth through preachers. He uses, in the Old Testament, a jackass. If there's any difference between, never mind. So he used a mule in the Old Testament to preach truth. In the New Testament, he preached truth through the beak of a rooster to Peter. He took Pharisees who hated his insides and got them to tell the truth. They were standing around the cross saying, "Ho, he saved others. Himself he cannot save." Folks, that's the absolute truth. You cannot save others and save yourself. You cannot save yourself and save others. Ministry comes out of what? Leastness. And in the death, a tree is produced that brings about ministry. And ministry is a direct result of the dying, the loss of your life. So if you want in on ministry, if there's any inclination of pride, if there's any inclination of performance, if there's any inclination towards, fame, popularity, if there's any of that, ministry is dead. Ministry is gone. The only time there's any ministry at all is in the death process and becoming a tree. This is everywhere. We have been working through the book of Matthew, and of course have reached now in this process with you, chapter 13. But we spent months in chapter 10. Chapter 10, let me remind you, you've forgotten. Chapter 10 is a phenomenal chapter because Jesus has, in chapter 9, the end of chapter 9, seen the multitudes and his heart is broken, and there's just so much pressure, and there's so much need out there, and there's so many people that just need help. It's just overwhelming, and he knows he needs to duplicate his ministry. So he decides what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a prayer meeting with my disciples. And he calls them and says, hey, the harvest is plenty, the laborers are few. Pray the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into the harvest field. And so they all hit their knees, man, and they're screaming at the top of their lungs, oh, great God of the sky, send out laborers into the harvest field. Jesus jumps to his feet and says, whoa, your prayers are answered. I'm sending you. Lo and behold, the 12 are now going to be sent. He reaches down inside of himself at the beginning of chapter 10, grabs a hold of some of the power that he contains within himself, and transfers it to them. They now have the power to cast out demons, raise the dead, and heal the sick. Now, he's going to, before you go out, he says, I got some instruction for you. And all of chapter 10 is the instruction on ministry. He gets them aside in a seminar on Saturday and teaches them how to wave their hands. No, he doesn't. He doesn't teach them techniques. He doesn't teach them, let me tell you how to give an altar call, stir the emotions. He doesn't do that. He describes ministry to them. Now, you would expect to march into that description of ministry that he's going to give, and you would expect him to say, oh, can you hear this? Come and be Superman of ministry. Or come and be the millionaire businessman for Christ. Woo! I'll do that. You can see him appealing to the ladies of the crowd. Come and be the beauty queen for Jesus. You can see him crying out to his people, saying, come, and be the top athlete, the $1 million contract athlete for Christ. Woo! Having an influence. You would think that would be what he would do, which would appeal to ministry. He gives none of those illustrations. You know what kind of illustrations he gives? He says, I'll tell you in describing ministry. He says, I am sending you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. Sheep in the midst of wolves. What kind of imagery is that? Can you see standing up in front of 100 teenagers wanting to attract them to full-time ministry, saying, come and be sheep in the midst of wolves? Who's going to respond to that? You know what sheep do to wolves? They bite them. This is not good. And literally what he does in the passage is he says, hey, come, and I'm going to give you the address where the wolves gather together, and I want you to go out and visit them and say, hey, here I am, a sheep. And sheep in itself is so repulsive. Sheep are the dumbest animals ever born. Sheep have no self-protection at all. Porcupines have quills. Turtles have shells. Sheep just nothing. Who would want to be that? And to give me an address, oh, here's where the wolves live. Get down and knock on their door. Hey, I'm here. But don't you realize the only taste a wolf is going to get of Jesus is going to be you? So don't you realize he's going to put you in the middle of a Philippi jail scene with a bleeding back for the purpose of a wolf getting a good taste of Jesus? And I've got the gall to gripe when things don't go well. Sheep in the midst of wolves. See, that's the same concept as here. He's talking about ministry is found where? In the man sowing in his field and the seed dying in its leastness, in order to produce a tree that ministers. I want to be used by God. Are you sure? Are you sure? I want to minister. Are you sure? Are you sure? Ah, dear Jesus. The wonder of what you've called us to. The embracing of my leastness, that you might take me as I'm totally open for you, the man who plants the seed in his field. You requiring no action out of me, only openness and yieldedness to you, that in that openness, paralleling death itself, I lose my life, that you might grow me into a destiny, a safe harbor, a nesting place, a balm, a place of healing. Could you make me? You're not talking about a church building. You're not talking about a CSC. You're talking about me becoming that. A place that's safe for people. Am I safe to be around? Heads are bowed. Mustard seed is a call to death. There is no life outside of it. The only problem you and I have ever had, in all of the forms that the problems have taken, from addictions to psychological problems to emotional upsets to whatever you want to name, the only problem we've ever had is in our leastness. We were not open to him. We refused to let him take us and plant us. And we simply remained alone on the palm of our own hand. If you seek to save your life, you'll lose it. If you'll lose your life for my sake, you will find it. Moments of seeking.